It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, as always, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And this segment, a subject that we have never talked about in some 700 shows, and that is the world of the Bushmen in Africa. And we are extremely pleased to have with us a very special guest today, James Suzman, and he is an anthropologist specializing in the Bushman peoples of Southern Africa. He's lived and worked with every major Bushman group. He was awarded a Smuts Commonwealth Fellowship in African Studies at Cambridge University and led the De Beers Group's award-winning sustainability and public affairs initiatives from there. There's a new work out called A Fluence Without Abundance, The Disappearing World of the Bushmen. James, how are you, my friend?
Very well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be on your show.
Well, we're extremely pleased to have you here. We have never talked about this. Let's do this for those of us that live in the middle of North America. Explain to our listeners specifically the definition of Bushmen, what it means to you, who are they, where do they live, and then let's also talk a little bit further about your background.
Okay, I'm very happy to do that. Well, the first thing to know is that the Bushmen, or the people that we refer to the Bushmen, refer to a sort of very broad group of people, in much the same way that people might talk about Native Americans, and it encompasses lots and lots of different language groups and so on. The term Bushman covers lots and lots of people. These people are all the indigenous people of Southern Africa. In other words, these are the descendants of the first populations that were there before, firstly, many black Africans migrated from northern Africa into southern Africa, and then, of course, before the various European civilizations colonized southern Africa in about the 1400s and 1500s. Now, what makes the Bushmen in particularly interesting is that they form part of the oldest clear genetic human lineage on the planet. So we have pretty good evidence to suggest that the Bushman peoples, and in genetic terms we refer to this group as the Khoisan, which is a term which refers to the kind of two main language groups. But we have very good genetic evidence to suggest now, and we tie this with archaeological evidence as well, to suggest that Bushmen have been living continuously in southern Africa for a staggering 150,000 years or more. What's also interesting with this new genetic and archaeological evidence is it suggests that not only were they the most sustainable population group to have ever lived on the planet, but actually up until about 20,000 years ago, they were the most populous group on the planet. So, in other words, there were more Bushmen than any other form of modern Homo sapiens, which had begun to expand and head over the, colonized rest of the world. What's also particularly interesting about the Khoisan was that the archaeological evidence suggests that the kind of technologies, the way they organized themselves socially, the way they lived, the model they had for living, and this includes things such as sort of hunting technologies, how big their group sizes were, actually remained fairly continuous for possibly 70,000, 80,000 years. And when anthropologists like myself and some of my predecessors studied amongst the Bushmen when they were still hunting and gathering, and now there are very few of them that do, and they've simply lost too much land. And again, very similar to the story of sort of Midwest America, people, indigenous populations losing land primarily to cattle ranches. And that's very much what's happened in southern Africa. But the evidence suggests that the hunting and gathering way of life practiced by some of the Khoisan people, the groups I work with who speak, and they all speak Kik languages, who hunted and gathered into the 20th century, lived a lifestyle very, very similar to what all of our hunting and gathering ancestors may have lived. Now, what makes it particularly interesting is that the certain aspects of their life, so beyond the obvious sort of questions about sustainability and environmental sustainability, their civilization endured an extraordinarily long period of time. There are other things that I think are very important to challenges that we face today. So the first and most obvious one, and it's one of the things that Bushmen became famous for in anthropology, is that typically they do not need to work particularly hard, or certainly as hunter-gatherers, they didn't have to work particularly hard to make a good living. So on average, able-bodied adults would be able to support all the people they needed to support, children, old, infirm people, on the basis of really no more than 2 hours work a day. Obviously things might get tough at certain times of year, but in general, people didn't have to work particularly hard to get by. So this is very much it's very much in contrast to the idea that somehow our hunting and gathering ancestors, and it's very much, we look at sort of Stone Age myths about the Stone Age and movies about the Stone Age, and you sort of create this image of people constantly being, struggling to survive or being chased by ferocious animals constantly. Actually, the evidence suggests that they had a really pretty good life. Now, the populations now, so I said 20,000 years ago, the Bushmen were probably the most populous group of any group on the planet, and indeed the most successful. Now we estimate that there are probably about only 100,000 people who identify themselves as Bushmen today. None of them survive exclusively by hunting and gathering, so the last century has been one of sequential and dramatic land loss, and this is something that I've been following and involved in very directly in terms of trying to sort of mitigate legally some of the consequences of this and support these populations. So they've effectively lost the ability to hunt and gather, and in much the same way as happened in the United States, but admittedly a century ago, or indeed in Australia with the Aboriginal populations. Bushman populations in, say, Namibia, where I do most of my work, are now largely confined to what are there called resettlement centers. So they've lost these vast areas of land that they had really 30, 40 years ago, where they're now squatters. All these lands have been surrendered to either commercial cattle ranches. So interestingly, the Eastern Kalahari in Namibia, as strange as it may seem, refers to itself sometimes as Little Texas. And other parts of their land have been surrendered to more traditional African farming communities, tribes like the Herero and the Botswana, who have very highly evolved, very developed cattle cultures. And as with happened between the encounter between agriculturalists, farmers, and hunter-gatherers all over the world, they tend to view Bushmen as somehow inferior and use that as a basis for justifying taking the land and so on. So there's very much a lively and ongoing rights scene happening there at the moment with big legal questions being asked. And sadly, life for most Bushmen these days is very, very difficult indeed. They're far worse nourished than they were as hunter-gatherers. They're highly politically marginalized. They live really in they depend on others to get their most basic needs, so they work mainly for cheap casual labor, often in return for alcohol, and a lot of them find solace for their misery in alcohol, which is again something that was entirely new to them. So life is tough for them now.
So I have a question for you. This is a world not seen by many, probably from the outside, and certainly not studied at the depth in which you did. And yet your book has an interesting premise, of fluence without abundance. Tell us about that title, and tell us what not necessarily the hidden, but the implied meaning is.
Yes, the title actually comes from a very famous essay written by an anthropologist called Marshall Sahlins in the 1960s. And he wrote this essay in response to the first data that came out. So up until the 1960s, anthropologists and pretty much everybody was of the view that hunter-gatherer life was, to use the words of Thomas Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. And as soon as the evidence came in from the first really detailed economic input-output analyses of how hard people worked and how they spent their time, And we got this data on basically the 15-hour work week. It got relabeled by Marshall Silence as this idea of, they got, rechristened the original affluent society. And that was partially in response. There was a book out at around the same time by an economist called John Kenneth Galbraith, who was looking at the ideas of, economic development and so on, called the affluent society. And so this was a slight play on terms. But what it was it pointed to the suggestion that actually hunter-gatherers thought about economics in a profoundly different way to the way that certainly we do now, and the way that most of humanity has since the agricultural revolution. Now, if you think about contemporary economics, it's all based on a single axiom, and that axiom, it has various different names. Some people call it the economic problem, or the basic economic problem, or the problem of scarcity. I mean, that's the other widely used label. And that problem of scarcity suggests that human needs are infinite, but our means are limited. And so we continuously work and strive to try and satisfy these apparently infinite desires and wants. And that is the basis of our ambitions, our working life, our economic activity, and so on. Now, what was interesting with the hunter-gatherers was that they were always in a position to be able to do more work. So if there was a particularly prolific harvest of, say, a fruit that occurred only seasonally. What was interesting with hunter-gatherers was that they never took more than they needed to meet their immediate needs. So in other words, they didn't, if there was a particular, for the Bushmen, for example, in the area I work, there's a nut and a fruit called the mangete, the mongongo, which is incredibly rich in proteins and it's wonderful oils, and it's also got lovely sweet fruit. And when it's prolific, people would harvest it and eat it, but they wouldn't save it. They wouldn't sort of say, well, in 6 months' time, it's going to be the late dry season, we'll be hungry. Everything was focused on meeting the present. And it was based on this kind of confidence that they had that the environment would always provide for their basic needs. And as a result, they kind of inverted this economic problem. So this idea that somehow we are driven by infinite desires, which is very much part of certainly our dominant economic culture now. The way the Bushmen organized themselves, and indeed many other hunting and gathering communities, was to have, instead of having infinite desires and limited means, they had few desires that were easily and straightforwardly met. So in other words, they achieved their affluence not by getting as much stuff as they possibly could, which is our model of affluence, somehow this idea that we'll buy ourselves out of work. Instead, what they did was they simply moved the goalposts, and they had fewer desires, which were easily met. And so, on the basis of that, on the whole, people tended to be much more satisfied than certainly many of their Western counterparts are. Of course, that's no longer possible for Bushmen today, who have been sucked unwillingly, I might add, into the cash economy on which they are dependent.
Well, if you've just joined us, I got a good one going here. We're talking about The Disappearing World of the Bushmen by James Suzman, who is one of the world's leading authorities on that group, on that culture. A brand new work called A Fluence Without Abundance, The Disappearing World of the Bushmen. Let me ask you something, James. How many people, how many people are studying these people, but is interest in this group, is interest in this culture, is it waning as time goes along, or is there a renewed interest in studying the Bushmen?
Well, I'm kind of hoping that my book might help renew interest a little bit. The truth is, this is a disappearing culture. So the ability for somebody, in the 1960s, when there was a real interest in hunter-gatherers and in groups like the Bushmen. But that was really the last moment that these peoples were still able to hunt and gather autonomously. There's very few societies left anywhere that are able to hunt and gather autonomously now. Having said that, I think this is an era where it's tremendously important for us to get a better understanding of how our hunting and gathering ancestors lived. Because we're sort of sitting at a crossroads at the moment. it is clear, no matter what your position are, that there's certain environmental strains that our planet is under at the moment. And, a mere century ago, the human population was only 2 billion people. We're now shifting upwards towards 8 billion. And anybody who's lived or worked anywhere in the so-called great wild places has seen things change very dramatically in front of their eyes. In my lifetime, which is not particularly long, or indeed in the 30-odd years I've been working just in the Kalahari, the changes I've seen have been pretty astronomical. Now, my sense is that we're sort of at an inflection point in the history of our species. And it's a very interesting one because in many ways we have solved the basic economic problem. In other words, we are now as a species productive enough, and through technology, through hard work, through skills, but we're productive enough to ensure that everybody on the planet is actually pretty well fed. Last year, I'm not sure what the exact statistics were, but it roughly worked out that for every human being alive, and I'm afraid I speak in kilograms, so I'm not sure what it involves in pounds, but for every human being alive, roughly about 180 kilograms of food was thrown away, ended up in landfill sites. And I suppose that's probably about 500 pounds of food. And we look again at other things. We've reached this extraordinary level of productivity. And there's a risk that our kind of continuing focus on productivity is going to effectively cannibalize our future. So I know there's plenty of debate in different sectors about, say, the potential impacts of global warming and so on, and climate change. There's debate about the impact of things, sort of challenges to biodiversity and so on. But it is clear that there are some impacts happening, and that where you have limited resources, if you keep churning through them, and you don't have an ability to renew them, then you're likely to be in trouble. Now, I think by looking back and understanding how these populations became so sustainable and so successful. So if you think about it, the agricultural revolution happened only around 10,000 years ago. And since then, we've seen extraordinary changes and new risks to our species' survival. Now, if you think that before that you had 180,000, possibly 250,000 years of human history, which didn't have these great existential risks to their survival, there might be something that we can learn from how people organize themselves, from how people interacted and related with their environments, and how people dealt with questions such as the need to have hard work. So, for example, in the United States and in Europe at the moment, there is a great deal of debate about the potential dangers posed by automation, computerization, and robots. And most of that discussion is focused on the future of work. And the worry is that, if these computers and robots and automated cars, take away the jobs of the Uber drivers or the taxi guys or the transport shifters or the delivery guys, what are these people going to do? Somehow there's this sense that without work, people cannot be a legitimate or functioning member of a society. So I think people often confuse the idea of sort of being employed with being purposeful. And I think our species is very, very purposeful indeed. But there's extraordinary change that is confronting us. And if you thought about it 50 or 60 years ago, you look at cartoons that projected things into the future, like the Jetsons or what have you. Actually, this idea that that we might be liberated from, tedious and difficult jobs by automation was something that everybody looked forward to. This idea that people could actually work less and focus as they imagined. There's very famous economist John Maynard Keynes imagined what the economy would look like in the time of his grandchildren. And he saw it as people being liberated from the drudgery of the workplace to be able to focus on things like poetry, art, religion, language, consciousness, and enjoyment, and family life. All these things which I think most people hold dear. And this required sort of embracing the change, the transition to a less work-based economy. And I think this is where we can start looking and trying to understand better how our species dealt with these issues in the past, how humans dealt with it, because there's a sense amongst many of us that to work is natural. We are a species that work. We cannot not work. And certainly that's how I was brought up, and it seems a very powerful and compelling idea. But the history of hunter-gatherers suggests that actually we're not all hostage to this continuous desire to work, create, make more money, and enrich ourselves, but we are purposeful. And, certainly doing something like this, I have a choice when I wrote this book, which is, I'm certainly not going to earn me a tremendous amount of money. I could have instead stayed working at the mining company that I worked at for 7 years, and I'd be a great deal richer. But for purposiveness, writing this book, I think, has been considerably more rewarding. So this is why I think it's important to understand the hunter-gatherer world now, partially because it will help us to develop insights into the very new kinds of problems that we, as humanity, are going to have to face and solve in the future.
Indeed. Well, James, as we start to kind of wind down here a little bit, you have been studying, again, this group for a long, long time. You've spent quite a bit of time with them. I have a question for you. As an anthropologist and as someone that has, again, worked, studied, and learned so much about and with them, how has your opinion, or has it changed, about them and sort of what they bring to the table and their view of things? How has it changed over the course of the work that you've done? Where did you start maybe with them, and where are you arriving now?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the truth is, with anthropologists live life as a sort of journey. The thing which makes anthropology different to many other subjects that you might study at university is the way we go about our method of studying. And that method of studying is effectively to parachute somebody in on their own with no real support into a community whose culture, habits, customs, behaviors, rituals, ways of doing things are completely different from your own. So it's kind of like a cold, shock of cold water. Now, the method of studying people like that is to remain in a society embedded deeply enough for long enough that all these customs and things that at first began to look bizarre or weird or unsettling, you begin to see their internal logic. You begin to feel that they're normal. And at the same time as doing that, you begin to ask questions of your own culture. So, for example, when you start looking at things, you sort of wonder why, if in a society when people greet, they sort of bump their chests with one another. But at the same time, you sort of take that step back and you start thinking, well, why is it that we shake a right hand? Or why is it that in Paris people kiss 3 times on the cheeks? So what it does is it sort of gives you this kind of in-between space. And ultimately what that does is it changes people from being, I suppose, objects of difference. So the Bushmen were very different in many ways in terms of clothing, in terms of outlook, in terms of how they lived. And that was my first impressions of them, living and working among them. But over time, as that got normalized, I began to see and engage with people as distinct, empowered, and interesting individuals in much the same way that I see people in my life here in Cambridge as distinct, empowered, interesting individuals, some of whom I like more than others, some of whom I might dislike, some of whom I consider to be unpleasant characters, and some of whom I find real inspiration. So that's been the real transition, is from seeing them as this kind of undifferentiated mass, an object to study and understand as hunter-gatherers, to actually highly individuated people with whom I have real, long-lasting, and I hope very enduring relationships with.
Well, again, it is a fascinating work called "A Fluence Without Abundance: The Disappearing World of the Bushmen" by James Suzman. He is an anthropologist specializing in these works of the Bushmen people of Southern Africa. He's lived and worked there, and worked with every major group. He's also studies at Cambridge University, and you've seen his writings in the New York Times, amongst others. James, how can people find out more about some of the research and the writings that you've done, and maybe pick up a copy of the book?
Well, I believe the books are on sale everywhere in the United States at the moment, and if they're not available at local bookshops, then they certainly will be available through Amazon. It's also very simple to find me on the internet, so sort of quick search of my name is easy enough. And there is also a wealth of information on Bushmen, written by others as well, in the United States. There is at least one charitable organization in the United States run by other anthropologists called the Kalahari People's Fund, which does tremendous work, in particular focusing on educational issues and support for some communities. So there's a great deal of information out there, very easy to find on the internet, and also a great deal of basic information in anthropology textbooks for university students. But I'd like to think that my book offers a very nice introduction to this and to understanding hunter-gatherers and beginning to understand why anthropology is so important for us now.
Well, again, appreciate your time. Again, the work called A Fluence Without Abundance. Thank you so much, and really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you very much.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large. You love your dog and you love your yard, but sometimes what your dog leaves behind can make you not love your yard so much. Well, when that happens, it's Call of Duty Pet Waste Removal Service to the rescue. Large or small dogs, big yard or small, call Call of Duty. They clean up the mess your dog leaves behind. So if you're tired of cleaning pet waste from your yard, call Call of Duty, 764-7224. That's 764-7224. Prompt, effective, courteous services on the way. Your yard is left clean and waste-free. So don't waste any more time on waste. Call Call of Duty in Lawrence, 764-7224. That's 764-7224. Or visit their website, callofduty2010.web.com.